Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. The front door was unlocked. The jewelry was scattered like someone had fled in panic. And Dawn, she was lying half naked by the stone steps. No screams, no witnesses, no signs of forced entry, just silence. And inside the house, her husband Andrew, hanging. They called it a peaceful retirement. But this was something else. It was February 6th, 2025. A quiet Wednesday in Les Pesquies, a sleepy commune in the Aveyron region of southern France. At 8:42 a.m., a neighbor approached the couple's rural home after they failed to respond to multiple texts and a missed breakfast appointment. What she saw prompted an immediate emergency call to French authorities. When first responders arrived, they found the body of 56-year-old Dawn Searle near the front entrance of the home. She was lying partially unclothed with visible trauma to the head. There were no signs of a struggle in the area around her. No footprints in the wet grass, no drag marks on the gravel path. Nearby, scattered along the stone steps and doorway, were her personal items: rings, a thin silver chain, and one earring snapped clean at the post. Inside the residence, officers located the second body, 62-year-old Andrew Searle. He had died by hanging, suspended from a ceiling beam in the living room. A folded hand towel had been knotted around his mouth. There were no notes, no signs of a third person, and no apparent forced entry. The house was in disarray, drawers partially opened, a toppled jewelry box near the foot of the stairs, but curiously, nothing of significant value appeared to be missing. Cash was untouched. The safe, closed but unlocked, contained passports, documents, and banking folders. At first glance, the scene suggested a potential burglary gone wrong, but within hours, that theory started to erode. There were no broken locks, no tool marks around windows or doors, no foreign DNA on the interior doorknobs or stair rails. Neighbors hadn't heard anything unusual the night before. No dogs barking, no car engines, no raised voices. The couple's Peugeot remained parked in the gravel driveway. The house itself, a stone cottage with a gated entrance, was surrounded by open fields and isolated from any neighboring structures. French gendarmerie established a perimeter and called in forensic technicians by mid-morning. Crime scene photographs began immediately, and by the afternoon, 2 post-mortem orders had been issued. For investigators, what followed wasn't the rush of leads but a void. No one reported seeing anything. No alarm triggers, no surveillance cameras from nearby homes. This was a remote area, after all. Even the interior motion sensors inside the house had been disabled weeks prior. There were no known threats and no outstanding disputes on record. That silence was what made this case so difficult, and to a trained investigator, that kind of silence is rarely natural. The data aligned too cleanly, one investigator remarked later. Sometimes that's the problem. Andrew and Dawn had moved to France permanently in 2023, leaving behind a tidy life in Scotland. They were both British citizens, well-educated, financially secure, and semi-retired. No children lived with them. No known medical conditions. They had no criminal history. It was, as one report would note, a stable domestic profile. The autopsy on Dawn Searle would later confirm blunt force trauma to the head. She had sustained multiple lacerations to the scalp consistent with repeated strikes from a hard-edged object. Her fingernails were unbroken. No defensive wounds were found on her arms or hands. Toxicology returned clean. She had not ingested sedatives, alcohol, or narcotics before her death. Time of death, estimated between 10:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. Andrew's cause of death was ruled as asphyxiation due to hanging. His hands bore no cuts, bruises, or restraint marks. His airway showed no signs of external compression. The towel around his mouth was tied post-mortem. Toxicology showed no substances of note. Body temperature, lividity, and muscle rigidity suggested death occurred approximately 4 hours after dawn. The implications were chilling. No sign of forced entry, no active alarms, 2 bodies, no note, and a 3 to 4 hour window between deaths inside a locked home. That wasn't coincidence, that was sequencing. By the end of the first day, French authorities were quietly considering a scenario far different from the original burglary theory. But with no eyewitnesses, no weapon recovered, and no digital surveillance, they needed something more definitive. A clearer timeline, a motive, a pattern. That meant digging into everything the Searles left behind. their marriage, their finances, their communications, and their digital history. But first, it meant understanding who they were and how a couple with no known enemies ended up dead in their own home. They came to France for the quiet. No one questioned that, not their neighbors, not their family, not the few friends they still kept in touch with back in Scotland. On paper, they were the kind of couple you'd expect to disappear into early retirement without a trace. Not like this. Dawn Searle was 56, British-born, divorced once, a project manager by trade, and a mother of 2 adult sons. Her oldest, Callum Kerr, had made a name for himself in television. By all accounts, Dawn was quiet, organized, and cautious. She had no history of substance abuse, no outstanding debts, and no criminal record. Her medical files were clean. She was on no regular prescriptions except for vitamin D supplements and a mild anti-inflammatory for arthritis. Andrew Searle, 62, was a different profile. Former financial investigator, worked for major UK institutions including Barclays and Standard Life before moving into contract assignments for the Serious Fraud Office. He had held security clearances in the past. No children, no previous marriage, no criminal history, no known behavioral or psychiatric conditions. According to archived SFO personnel records reviewed by British authorities at France's request, Andrew had above-average cognitive performance, below-average social adaptability. The couple met in Edinburgh and married in 2023. Their relocation to France came swiftly after. Some called it impulsive, others said it made sense. He was the kind who needed a reset, one acquaintance would later say. She was the kind who'd go along with it to keep peace. In May 2023, they purchased a small stone home in Les Pesquiers, a rural commune in the Occitanie region, for $218,000 in cash. Property records confirmed the deed was in both names. The home had 3 bedrooms, a detached garage, and no installed alarm system. The seller had described the area as quiet and self-reliant. Local law enforcement began interviewing neighbors the day after the bodies were discovered. Most statements were routine. The couple kept to themselves, no visible tension, no signs of conflict. Polite. British. Liked their garden. That was the consensus. But 2 residents gave statements that caught attention. One neighbor reported seeing Dawn alone on daily walks over the past 3 weeks. Used to be they walked together. Lately, just her. Another mentioned Dawn had been distant at the last community wine tasting, declining to stay long. She didn't seem upset, just withdrawn. The behavioral change wasn't flagged immediately, but when combined with subsequent forensic discoveries, it started to matter. French investigators requested digital access to the couple's devices. Under EU law, spousal consent wasn't applicable in a criminal death investigation. The laptop found in the upstairs office, registered to Andrew, had been in regular use. His browsing history was extensive. Among news and finance pages were multiple searches between January 9th and February 4th related to French inheritance law, cross-border death notifications. What happens if spouse dies without a will? Quietest methods of suicide. On Dawn's personal tablet, a different set of queries appeared, fewer and less frequent. Can I leave France without telling my husband? Temporary return to UK from France. Legal issues. Divorce process for UK citizens in France. None of this was proof of intent, but it was relevant. There were no emails or messages indicating a plan or threat. No known history of domestic abuse, verbal or physical. No restraining orders, no police calls. Financial records showed Dawn had access to a shared checking account but had not withdrawn funds independently in over 2 months. She wasn't trapped, but she wasn't in control, one digital analyst later noted. Their social life was minimal. Their closest human contact was the supermarket staff, where they bought groceries every few days. On February 5th, CCTV footage from a local market showed them shopping together around 8:10 p.m. They bought bread, cheese, 2 bottles of red wine, and a lottery ticket. Dawn was seen smiling, though briefly. Andrew paid in cash. They returned home by 8:45 p.m. After that, there were no further public sightings, no outgoing calls, no device activity until Dawn's body was discovered nearly 12 hours later. Investigators interviewed Dawn's sons via video call. Callum stated he hadn't spoken to his mother in 4 days but received a message from her on February 2nd. It was short. I'll call this weekend. All's fine here. Just tired. He said it felt routine, but she normally called, not texted. Dawn's last known personal communication, aside from that message, was a private reply on Facebook to an old friend in Scotland. The timestamp was February 3rd at 10:08 a.m. It read simply, Might come back for a bit. Just need to think. We'll message more soon. The message wasn't alarming, but in hindsight, it was the final breadcrumb. There were no known visitors to the home in the days before the deaths. Deliveries stopped on February 4th. The property had a closed gate, no security footage, and only one way in. There was no record of any calls to 911 or emergency services from either of their phones prior to the neighbor's discovery call. Neither device showed recent calls, texts, or alerts after the evening of February 5th. It was a clean digital drop-off. No alarms, no cries for help, just a shared silence, digital and physical. And that silence now held the weight of two bodies in a community with no answers. There was no broken glass, no tool marks on the frames, no kicked-in door. The entrance was open when the neighbor arrived, but the lock wasn't damaged. Investigators confirmed that the front door was unlocked from the inside, the bolt retracted cleanly, no signs of tampering. This wasn't a home someone had forced their way into. It was a home someone had let things happen inside. The interior scene, recorded meticulously by the French forensics unit, raised immediate red flags. Several drawers were pulled out, jewelry scattered, and two wine glasses were still resting on the kitchen counter. One with a partial lip print, but nothing of significant value was missing. A small safe was located in the hallway closet. It was shut but not locked, and it contained two British passports, a manila folder of account statements, and €470 in cash. The contents were untouched. The living room where Andrew was found showed no sign of a struggle. He was suspended from a crossbeam using a reinforced nylon cord that investigators later traced to a spool in the garage. His mouth had been tightly wrapped with a folded hand towel, secured with a knot behind the head. No other bindings were present. His feet had been flat against a wooden chair, which lay tipped over beneath him. Autopsy placed Andrew's time of death between 4:30 and 6 a.m., at least 3 hours after Dawn's estimated window of death. There was no evidence of restraint marks or trauma beyond the ligature compression. Toxicology returned negative. The towel around his mouth showed only his own DNA, a detail that drew quiet concern from one of the forensic techs. The knot was atypical for a self-applied gag. Too tight, too centered, not impossible to do alone, but rare. It raised the question, if this was suicide, why the gag? There was no one left to silence. Further complicating the picture was the state of Dawn's body. She had been found outside the front entrance, clothed only from the waist down. Her injuries, blunt force trauma to the back and side of the skull, suggested multiple impacts from a firm, non-bladed object. No fragments were recovered at the scene, and no blood trails led from inside the house. However, spatter patterns on the interior entry wall suggested the attack started indoors and ended outside. The forensic pathologist concluded that Dawn had been struck at least twice, likely from behind, with force consistent with a heavy household object. No defensive wounds were present. She died quickly, possibly within minutes of the initial blow. The body had been outside for less than 6 hours based on lividity and temperature readings. No signs of postmortem movement. The partial scattering of her jewelry, one earring bent, a bracelet clasp broken, initially suggested a possible struggle, but no foreign fingerprints were recovered from those items. Investigators theorized the jewelry may have been dislodged during the fall, not ripped off. There were no signs of a forced burglary, nothing stolen, nothing ransacked in a way that would suggest panic or haste. There was disarray, yes, but it was selective. Just the drawers in the master bedroom, just the jewelry box. Everything else remained untouched, and yet one thing stood out. On the nightstand in the guest bedroom, investigators found a tablet still charging. It belonged to Dawn. The last browser tab left open was a French legal resource page. Procédures de séparation pour les ressortissants britanniques en France. Procedures for separation for UK nationals in France. Timestamp, February 4th, 9:52 p.m. That search alone wasn't proof of anything, but combined with the staged disorder, the inconsistency in Andrew's gag, and the internal-external disconnect of the body locations, it all pointed away from randomness. The tech report from the doorframe came in next. There were no pry marks, no scuffs, no external interference. From a forensic standpoint, entry into the home was voluntary. One investigator phrased it plainly. If someone came in, they had a key or were already inside. Meanwhile, the temperature and lividity data confirmed a key point in the timeline. Dawn died first. Andrew died hours later. That order would shape the entire trajectory of the investigation from this point forward. There were no weapons found in or near the house, nothing with blood, skin, or residue. The assumption, based on impact trauma and force distribution, was that the murder weapon had been removed, or was so commonplace it didn't register as suspicious. French authorities coordinated with British liaison officers to analyze the couple's financial statements, medical records, and any history of insurance claims. No unusual activity, no life insurance recently taken out, no debts, no upcoming court dates, no indications of fraud or third-party targeting. In cases of domestic homicide, the crime scene often tells a story in what it lacks. No forced entry, no ransacked valuables, no getaway tracks. The absence of chaos is sometimes louder than violence. And in this house, the silence was starting to echo. The physical evidence inside the Searle residence had already raised doubts about a break-in, but it was the digital forensics that started narrowing those doubts into a pattern. When French authorities secured the crime scene on February 6, 2025, they recovered 4 devices: Andrew's personal laptop, Dawn's tablet, a shared desktop computer in the upstairs study, and 2 mobile phones, both powered off but not wiped. All 5 were handed over to the Brigade Numérique, France's cybercrime division, for forensic imaging and metadata extraction. The full report was returned within 72 hours. Andrew's laptop had been used last on the night of February 5th at 10:31 p.m. The session ended with no shutdown, just a lid close. Chrome history showed he had visited British news sites, checked currency exchange rates, and read a blog post about preparing for simple, non-disruptive end-of-life transitions. No activity after that timestamp. Dawn's tablet showed a different trail. Her last interaction was recorded at 9:52 p.m. on the same night, browsing a French legal advisory site for foreign nationals filing for divorce or legal separation. The page had been translated into English using Google Translate. The screen was still active when investigators found the device plugged in next to her bed. The shared desktop computer had been inactive for 2 full days, but its cloud sync function updated automatically. That's where investigators found a set of draft documents, unsaved but recoverable through temporary cache, believed to be created in Microsoft Word. One file stood out. It was titled Plan Options and contained fragmented bullet points: temporary return to Scotland, joint account access, legal advice, what can be done from UK notifying Callum. There were no dates, no direct language of fear or urgency. But the metadata indicated it had been opened and edited twice, once on February 2nd and again on February 4th, less than 36 hours before the deaths. The phones told a quieter story. Dawn's device last pinged the local network at 8:44 p.m. on February 5th, approximately the time she and Andrew returned from the store. No texts were sent after that, no calls made. Her last received message was a read receipt from her son delivered 3 hours earlier. Andrew's phone had no recorded outgoing communication that day, but investigators noted something subtle. At 11:07 p.m., his device had opened a secure vault app called Notate. The app required a fingerprint which matched his. No files were saved inside, only a blank journal entry, time-stamped and empty. Forensic techs couldn't determine if content had been deleted or if it was simply a new note never filled in. But the fingerprint usage proved he accessed it voluntarily. That discrepancy, the decision to open a blank note late at night and never write, didn't carry legal weight, but it added to the psychological profile emerging from the case. One consistent anomaly emerged across all devices. Every single item of outgoing communication from February 5th stopped before 9 o'clock p.m. From that point forward, no calls, no app activity, no screen unlocks, just a full digital shutdown. No remote wipes, no SIM removal, no airplane mode, just nothing. This behavior contrasted sharply with both individuals' patterns. Dawn typically checked email every night between 9:30 and 10:15. Andrew often read financial blogs past midnight. Investigators used screen time data to establish that this sudden silence was a deviation, not a routine. It was too coordinated. 2 devices, 2 people, both going dark at the same time. That's not natural drift. That's interruption. Metadata showed no unusual IP access attempts, no device mirroring, no deleted apps. But on the shared computer, A temporary internet file showed an attempt to access a remote storage drive, denied due to credential failure. This occurred at 10:44 p.m., 13 minutes after Andrew's last laptop use. Investigators could not confirm whether the action came from him or an automated script, but the pattern was inconsistent with his regular habits. An unsubmitted email draft was recovered from Dawn's Gmail cache. It was composed February 3rd, never sent. If anything goes wrong, please just know I had a plan. I wasn't afraid. I was just trying to be smart about it. No recipient field, no subject line, no send time. The tech team confirmed it was written from her tablet and not synced to any cloud folder. It had remained buried in browser cache, retrievable only through low-level forensic imaging. That single draft, unsent, incomplete, easily overlooked, would later be cited as the only evidence resembling an emotional footprint in the entire case file. The digital evidence didn't just map behaviors, it revealed silence. Not accidental, not forgotten, but enforced. Either both devices coincidentally ceased at the same time, or one did, and the other was silenced. By the afternoon of May 9, 2024, the shutters of the Searles' holiday home in southwestern France remained tightly closed. Neighbors, mostly retirees who lived year-round in this quiet hamlet near Montlore, began to grow concerned. The British couple, Dawn and Andrew Searle, were often seen walking together to the local bakery or working in the garden. But that week, no one had seen either of them. A local woman who'd become familiar with Dawn through weekly market trips noticed the mail piling in their box and the garden hose stretched awkwardly across the front path. After knocking on the door twice and getting no answer, she called the gendarmerie. It was protocol, nothing dramatic yet. When the gendarmes arrived just before sunset, they entered through an unlocked back door. What they found inside was not burglary. It was not even a sign of struggle in the traditional sense. The house was eerily quiet, undisturbed. In the master bedroom, they found both Dawn and Andrew. Dawn was lying motionless on the bed, a faint mark visible on her neck. Beside her, Andrew appeared lifeless, with no visible injuries at first glance. There was no sign of a break-in, no drawers ransacked, no valuables missing. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, and no chaos. For the French investigators, something immediately felt off. The scene didn't match a robbery gone wrong. There was no third-party presence, no defensive wounds, no sign of forced entry. And then, as they examined Andrew's body more closely, they discovered a nearly empty container of pills tucked beneath the bed. The French coroner would later confirm it was a large dose of amitriptyline, an antidepressant found in fatal concentration in Andrew's bloodstream. But it was Dawn's death that triggered the red flags. Her cause of death was not overdose. There was bruising on her neck, consistent with manual strangulation. The autopsy confirmed asphyxiation due to external compression of the airway. Time of death was estimated at approximately 48 hours before their bodies were found, putting the incident likely between May 7th and early May 8th. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. This was not a double suicide. It was a domestic homicide suicide. Andrew had likely strangled his wife, then taken his own life shortly after. The Searles' daughter, who had been in contact with both parents until the days leading up to their deaths, confirmed to UK authorities that her father had shown signs of increasing paranoia, believing Dawn was preparing to leave him permanently. Though he had no recorded history of violent behavior, French investigators were given notes found in a small drawer of the nightstand. Handwritten by Andrew, they appeared fragmented, references to betrayal, loss, and starting over. One line stood out: she never planned to stay. Digital records from Dawn's UK email account showed she had made inquiries about divorce mediation as recently as mid-April. She had also been looking at long-stay rentals in Dorset. A message dated April 24th to a friend said, "I just need to get through one more visit to France, then I'll be free." This trip, it seemed, was supposed to be their last together. Investigators believe the killing occurred at night, likely after an argument. There was no evidence of premeditation beyond Andrew's emotional writings. No weapons, no elaborate plan, just control, desperation, and the final act of a man who couldn't accept losing control of a long-term partner. Back in Scotland, the Searles' extended family were shocked but not entirely surprised. A cousin of Dawn's later told investigators that Andrew had always needed things his way. Friends echoed similar concerns, sharing that Dawn had become withdrawn in recent months, describing her marriage as something she had to manage. The French authorities ruled the case closed as a murder-suicide. No criminal charges were filed, as the perpetrator was deceased. The gendarmerie released a short statement confirming that there was no evidence of third-party involvement and that the family had been notified. There was no funeral in France. Dawn's remains were repatriated quietly to the UK, where a private service was held in early June. Andrew was cremated locally with minimal notice. The vacation home now stands empty. For sale signs have appeared, but neighbors say no one lingers there long. They remember the couple fondly, but also speak of how silence can be deceptive. The investigation entered its final phase as French authorities coordinated with Police Scotland and Interpol to process the cross-border elements of the Searle case. While the bodies had been recovered, the real focus now shifted to the motive, the psychological profile, and the legal classification of the incident. The French gendarmerie had filed their preliminary findings to the regional prosecutor's office in Limoges: homicide-suicide, domestic in nature, carried out by the husband, Andrew Searle. No charges would ever be brought. Andrew was deceased. But the investigation didn't stop there. In many homicide-suicide cases, especially involving British citizens abroad, law enforcement still sought to map out the sequence of psychological degradation and legal context. It wasn't just about what happened, it was about why it was allowed to escalate. At the center of that inquiry was the couple's relationship history. Their divorce had not yet been formalized, but interviews revealed they had been separated de facto for nearly 6 months. Dawn had been living in a flat in East Lothian, while Andrew remained in their primary residence. Court filings from Scotland showed that Dawn had initiated proceedings citing emotional abuse and financial coercion. The French prosecutor obtained a copy of her petition, which included statements about Andrew's escalating threats when she began seeking financial independence. Investigators requested digital access to both of their phones and emails. Dawn's email accounts, accessed with a warrant granted under Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty provisions, showed a pattern of recent communication with a UK-based attorney regarding asset division. She had made inquiries about potential pension splitting, specifically requesting full documentation of Andrew's military benefits. That was a critical trigger. Military pensions in the UK are tightly governed, and for a man like Andrew, retired RAF, career serviceman, it was a deep point of identity. Losing access or control was not merely a financial blow, it was a perceived stripping of authority. What investigators found next painted a clearer portrait. 2 days before the couple flew to France, Andrew had performed online searches about inheritance laws in France, particularly in the context of spousal death abroad. These weren't random searches. They included detailed queries about French succession law, whether an estranged spouse was still a legal heir, and whether property jointly owned could be automatically passed on if one partner died under ambiguous circumstances. That raised immediate red flags. It suggested a level of premeditation, not a heat-of-the-moment collapse. Further scrutiny of his Google history showed he had researched suicide methods, quiet, painless, and with the highest lethality. The final chilling query: carbon monoxide toxicity in sealed garages, France. The home's garage was, in fact, where Andrew's body had been found, slumped inside the vehicle, the doors shut, engine running, and a garden hose rerouted into the exhaust. Toxicology confirmed both deaths were consistent with that sequence. Dawn first by asphyxiation in the upstairs bedroom, smothered with a pillow. She had no defensive wounds. The forensic team concluded she had been taken by surprise, likely in her sleep. Andrew then sealed the house, made rudimentary notes, including a loosely worded apology left on the kitchen counter, and ended his own life. When police interviewed friends and neighbors back in East Lothian, one neighbor recounted a final conversation with Dawn days before the trip. She'd called the visit to France a formality, saying she just wanted things settled. She had planned to collect her share of personal effects and initiate mediation. Andrew, she noted, had insisted on one last trip, perhaps to save face or find closure. In hindsight, that invitation may have been a calculated trap. Back in France, law enforcement quietly closed the case. There would be no court proceedings, no trial. But the regional prosecutor issued a final communiqué outlining the critical indicators: control, obsession with legacy, fear of diminished masculinity, and labeled the case as an instance of coercive control resulting in fatal escalation. At the funeral held in two parts, one in Scotland for Dawn and one in France for Andrew, no family members requested joint remembrance. Dawn's children, from a previous marriage, held a private ceremony, declining to comment publicly. Andrew's surviving relatives issued only a brief statement, expressing sorrow but distancing themselves from his actions. Some may ask what could have prevented this. In truth, many systems were in place: legal channels, social support, psychological interventions, but control is often most dangerous when it is quietly embedded. Dawn's efforts to reclaim her autonomy came too late for intervention to matter. This chapter of the story is where many cases stop. Bodies identified, cause of death listed, case closed. But the deeper implications linger. The patterns observed here mirror those in many domestic violence homicides. Escalating psychological manipulation, strategic isolation, financial control, and the final act meant to reclaim power, even in death. I've read dozens of homicide-suicide files, but this one, the Searle case, still hits a precise nerve, not because of the brutality, but because of how many systems brushed against it and still failed to interrupt the trajectory. Following confirmation of Dawn's death by asphyxiation and Andrew's by carbon monoxide poisoning, the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit opened a secondary inquiry. They weren't seeking a perpetrator, he was already dead. They were evaluating whether institutional blind spots contributed to Dawn's death. Records from the East Lothian Council's Adult Protection Committee showed Dawn had made 2 informal disclosures to social workers in early 2024. She never requested intervention, she simply wanted documentation. That phrase, "in case something happens," was noted twice. But since she declined formal support, no full assessment was launched. Her GP records contained an appointment log noting chronic anxiety, possible sleep disruption, stress-related chest pain. No referral was made to psychological services. Even more troubling was the Scottish police call log. In March 2024, 3 months before the deaths, Dawn called non-emergency services to report harassment. Andrew had shown up uninvited to her flat 3 times in 1 week. He didn't break in, he just waited, outside. The responding officer advised her to consider a civil protection order. No record indicates she pursued one. In retrospect, this pattern matches dozens of cases flagged under the UK's Domestic Homicide Review (DHR) protocols, where controlling behavior escalates in the absence of physical violence and victims struggle to justify formal reporting. Dawn's workplace had also noticed changes. As an administrator at a local hospice, she was described as punctual, composed, and efficient. But her final months were marked by abrupt absences, missed deadlines, and one documented instance where she left the office in tears after receiving a call. Her supervisor asked if she wanted support. She declined. These fragments tell a clear story, not of inaction, but of fragmented concern, siloed data, and protocols that only activate when certain thresholds are met. By the time those thresholds are crossed, the outcome is often irreversible. In France, the prosecutor acknowledged these elements in a closing brief, but stopped short of assigning systemic blame. However, the case did lead to quiet discussions between British and French policymakers about post-Brexit cooperation in domestic violence cases involving expatriates. A retired domestic abuse investigator reviewing the case remarked, "This wasn't an impulsive man snapping. This was a calculated reclaiming of control. And the systems built to detect it, they don't speak to each other." That's the institutional failure that haunts many deaths like Dawn's. Not that no one saw it, but that no one saw it fully. When authorities in France concluded their on-site investigation at the holiday home in Meilhan-sur-Garonne, they transferred jurisdictional notes to British consular officials, triggering a parallel review in the UK. The inquest was inevitable, even if the facts now felt immovable. 2 bodies, 1 shooter, 1 survivor. Unspoken, silent, posthumous evidence. The forensic autopsy confirmed what the scene suggested. Dawn Searle, aged 56, died from a single gunshot wound to the head. There were no defensive injuries, no sign of struggle. The angle of entry, trajectory, and lack of hesitation marks ruled out suicide. The firearm used was a legally held hunting rifle registered to Andrew Searle, her husband. He died by a self-inflicted shot, likely within minutes of taking Dawn's life. The order was conclusive. He killed her, then himself. Toxicology found no traces of alcohol or sedatives in either of their systems. There was no chemical influence, no fog of decision-making. Andrew acted with full clarity, and that investigators quietly noted was perhaps the most chilling fact of all. British authorities proceeded with the inquest in Essex under standard coroner's jurisdiction. Testimonies were limited but precise. A history of controlling behavior, minor police contact in 2020 regarding a domestic dispute never escalated to formal charges. The French police shared scene photos, time-stamped forensic logs, and digital evidence, all corroborated the murder-suicide conclusion. No evidence of a third party, no evidence of forced entry, no sign of burglary, nothing missing. The cabin, surrounded by quiet fields, remained untouched except for the broken silence inside. Detectives reviewing Andrew's digital history in the weeks before the trip found no documented threats, no online searches suggesting premeditation, but they did uncover a withdrawn bank transfer days before departure and a message sent to a friend vaguely referencing things not being the same anymore. The friend testified that they believed it to refer to work stress, not marital discord. In hindsight, that assumption haunted them. The coroner delivered the official verdict. Dawn was unlawfully killed. Andrew died by suicide after committing homicide. The final record bears no ambiguity. Yet beyond official documentation, something deeper lingered, something systemic. Domestic homicide-suicide remains difficult to predict and prevent, especially in older couples with no recent history of legal intervention. Dawn never filed a formal complaint. Andrew was not on any risk watch list. There was no visible fuse burning, only the detonation. Inquiries from journalists and advocacy groups pointed out the gaps. How do we protect people in the absence of outward violence? How do systems detect coercive control that never gets logged? There were no easy answers, and no policy change emerged from this case. But its quiet devastation echoed in training rooms, seminars, and awareness campaigns. Back in Meilhan-sur-Garonne, neighbors who had once waved casually from across the vineyard path left flowers by the gate. Locals spoke of the tragedy in hushed tones. Un drame silencieux, they called it. A silent drama. No one had heard a gunshot. The bodies were discovered only after a scheduled cleaning crew arrived days later. By then, the truth had already hardened into fact. There is no resolution in stories like these, only documentation. Still, the story deserves telling, because even without visible bruises or restraining orders, victims of domestic control exist. Dawn Searle's name now sits on the long list of women killed by intimate partners, a list that is still growing. Her friends described her as quiet, artistic, deeply private. Her loss was not just personal, it was institutional, systemic. The kind of loss that demands society re-examine its thresholds for concern. Some stories end not with answers, but with a record. This is one of them. What happened to Dawn Searle could have been anyone's quiet tragedy. And that's the part that lingers, the silence before the violence. If there's one thing I've learned after telling stories like this, it's that control doesn't always come with bruises. Sometimes it comes with quiet decisions, isolation, and unchecked patterns. If you ever feel something is off, even when it's hard to explain, trust your instincts. You don't owe anyone your silence. Now I'd love to hear from you. What stood out to you most in Dawn's story? Have you ever witnessed a situation like this in your own life or community? Leave a comment below, share where you're from, or just tell me what part of the video made you pause. And if you didn't like this video, I'm open. Tell me why and let me know where you're watching from. If this story moved you or gave you something to think about, please consider subscribing to the channel. That's how you'll catch the next case we dive into, and your support helps keep these important stories alive.